Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of David's Divergent Discussions. Unsurprisingly, I'm your host, David Gray Hammond, and today we're going to be celebrating the fact that as of today, I am 8 years sober from drug and alcohol addiction. So, I'm joined today by Tigger Pritchard, Charlie Hart, and Ollie. And I'm really looking forward to this. It's going to be a good discussion, I think. So we're going to start with some brief audio descriptions. So my name's David. I am a mid-30s white Mediterranean male with a shaved head, a beard, a lip piercing. I'm wearing sunglasses and have a rather large ear stretcher. I'm sat in my famously blue room with the not rickety bookcase because I built a new one that's not going to fall over on me in the middle of a live stream. People are probably getting bored of hearing about that now, but I'm going to keep talking about it because I'm really proud of the fact that I know how to build a bookcase. Tigger, would you like to do a brief audio description?
Everybody, I am I can't believe I'm going to say this, a late 50s white male, Welsh heritage, shaven head, bit of bristle, it's quite grey as well, with a shirt and lovely jumper on. It's still kind of winter for me. I'm in what I call my Aughty den. And if you can see here, there's a moon globe and a deep field thing and a Lego Saturn V, and really looking forward to this evening. Hi, everybody.
And Charlie, would you like to do a brief audio description?
Hi, I'm Charlie Hart. I am a 48-year-old, would you believe, woman, wearing a Nirvana t-shirt and a infinity necklace. And behind me is my mural of a countryside scene and a rainbow. And I've got increasingly reddish hair.
And Ollie, would you like to do a audio description?
Hi, I'm Ollie, mid-30s transgender man, blonde-ish hair, teal vest top, tattoos, several dangly pendant necklaces, glasses. Background is just a white wall, and to my left and probably your right is just the corner of a pink cat tree. So yeah, hi.
Fantastic. So, like I said, I'm 8 years sober today. That's been a wild ride. I don't really know how to start this. How does one celebrate sobriety? I suppose I could tell my story a little bit, and then we can jump off from there with the conversation.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me, like my addiction, I grew up around addiction. My aunt was a drug and alcohol addict, and that was a difficult experience. And I always swore I would never take drugs or drink heavily. In my third year of sixth form college, so when I was studying my A-levels, because I did 3 years of that, not 2, a long-term relationship came to an end. And on that day, something really weird happened. I started hearing voices calling my name. And I couldn't work out where they were coming from. And that was the first day I had a cigarette. And that's a whole other thing because I'm still struggling to knock cigarettes and vaping and energy drinks on the head. But we'll get into that more later. But what I found was it very quickly progressed. So the next thing I did was about a week later, I went to a party and I smoked some weed, which I'd never done before. And something really strange happened because they always tell you, like, cannabis makes psychosis worse. Well, actually, cannabis made me feel way better. I found that when I was stoned, when I was drunk, I didn't feel paranoid. I didn't hear voices as much, or if I did, it didn't bother me as much. And so all through my final year of college, I was drinking really heavily and smoking a lot of weed. like I'd go out in the middle of the sort of the lessons and get drunk and high, and then go back to lessons completely off my face. And I suppose I should probably give a trigger. I should have given a trigger warning, really. If you hadn't worked it out, we're going to talk about drug use tonight, and alcohol use. But yeah, it was weird because I was like, okay, yeah, no, this makes me feel good. I don't need anything else. And then I went to university, and at university, people were like, oh yeah, you know, like you should try this drug or that drug. And there was this drug which was quite popular at the time when I was at university, called MCAT, or methadone. And I tried a bit of that because I figured, you know, everyone told me that cannabis was this dangerous drug that would end my life, and it didn't. So maybe they lied to me about other substances. And as it turned out, I just felt fantastic. I loved it. It was great. I mean, it didn't affect me in the same way it affected everyone else. I guess because I'm ADHD, like I felt really euphoric and happy, but I wouldn't say I felt overly stimulated. Within a very short period of time, I was doing about an ounce a night. So I was getting through about 28 grams a day of MCAT. And this is like a theme with my drug use. Like you got to remember that the drinking was there all the time in the background, quite heavy drinking. But with my drug use, I never sort of dabbled. Like if I was going to do it, I was all in. And over the years at university, I was doing huge quantities of methadone and ketamine and ecstasy. And then towards the end of my uni experience, probably because of all the drugs I'd smoked, my lung collapsed. I experienced a spontaneous pneumothorax. I didn't even know they could be spontaneous until that happened. I was just sat in my armchair one night and my lung collapsed. That was terrifying. And I was like, all right, that's it. Got to knock it all on the head. So I had a few months off uni because I had pneumonia and all sorts after that. And when I got back to uni, very quickly I was back on the drugs because although I hadn't really cottoned onto it by then, I was an addict. I couldn't just choose to stop. Like that's not how addiction works. And whilst I'd been ill, they'd been prescribing me an opiate painkiller called tramadol. And I discovered that it made me feel even better than any other drug I'd ever taken. And then the psychiatrist, because of my anxiety, was like, here's some diazepam. So now I was being given opiates and diazepam. And very quickly, I got very hooked on both of them. And my opioid use was spiraling. My benzo use was spiraling. Then I discovered a drug called Spice. That was a real bad thing to discover. For anyone who doesn't know what Spice is, some people in the news rather hysterically have called it the zombie drug. There was a real media hysteria around it. There was videos of people falling all over the place in the street and stuff like that. And I sort of came home from uni quite heavily addicted to opiates, benzos, and Spice. And I got very good at manipulating doctors, so I managed to get my hands on morphine and oxycodone and much stronger benzos than diazepam. And I was taking, I'd wake up in the morning, I would drink a bottle of Oromorph, which is morphine that you take by mouth rather than injection. And I was taking huge quantities of benzos, and I was smoking about 7 grams of Spice a day. And I started having seizures because my body just couldn't handle it. And I had this really weird habit of I kept journals on what I'd taken, how much I'd taken, the effect it had on me. It was sort of experimenting with how far I could push my body, which I've not really met anyone else who kept notes like that. Maybe that was just unique to me. Interestingly, throughout this, I'd kind of towards the end, started cottoning on that my behavior with this stuff was not great. And I tried using psychedelics to work out what it was that was driving it. And I kept feeling like I was getting close to it. But then eventually I just started using psychedelics like I did everything else, which really annoyed me because I know they have quite a potent. They're quite a good medicine according to the research that's coming out now. But I was very irresponsible with them, as I was with everything. It got to the point. I remember the day I decided I needed to stop. Like, actually decided I needed to stop. I'd had a massive seizure, and I woke up in resus, and I'd nearly lost my life. And I came out of hospital, and I went to my mum, and I went, I'm going down the substance misuse service, and I'm getting checked into a detox. Within about a week or so, I was in detox in a psychiatric ward, and I got completely off the benzos and the spice, and they lowered my Subutex prescription. Subutex is one of the opioid replacement drugs they give you to try and get you off opioids. They lowered that quite a bit. But whilst I was in there, the psychiatrist noticed that I was experiencing voice hearing and things like that, which I'd never told a psychiatrist about before. But I couldn't hide it anymore because I didn't have all these layers of drugs to drown everything out. And so they started me on antipsychotics. I came out of the psych ward about a month later, and I carried on reducing my Subutex prescription in the community. And it was April the 7th, 2016. I had my first day completely free of what I consider my drugs of addiction. And within a month, I was back in the psych ward. I'm about to mention some details of the psychotic experiences I had. I went into a full-blown psychotic episode. I believed that I was trapped in a computer simulation, that I was the only conscious being in that simulation. I believed I had microchips implanted in me that were broadcasting my thoughts. And I just completely went off the rails. I was hearing multiple voices. I was seeing things. I was just completely out of reality. And it was terrifying. And what happened was they kept me in the hospital for a month, got me onto a new antipsychotic, and it kind of leveled out a bit for a while. I've had to change the antipsychotics quite a few times, and I'm quite happy I found one that works properly now. But it was really weird because I came out, and bear in mind, I wasn't diagnosed autistic those 2 times in the psych ward. So they don't treat autistic people great in psych wards anyway, in the experiences I've heard of. And when you don't even know you're autistic, they just treat you like you're a nuisance. It was a really difficult experience in the psych ward. But the following November, that was in end of April to the end of May. In the November, I was put in front of a neurodevelopmental psych team. They said, we're going to assess you for 6 hours, 3 2-hour sessions. Within 45 minutes of the first session, they went, yeah, you're autistic. Like, we don't need the rest. You're autistic. And that was like a really weird moment for me because I kind of always sort of suspected it, and I'd been raised on the assumption that I probably was. But to have someone actually go like, you're autistic, like, we don't know how this has been missed your whole life. It was a really weird moment. And I started discovering quite slowly like little pockets of the internet where there were other autistic people and learning things. And it was a really, really, really odd experience. And like I was sober and my psychosis was still acting up, but I remember after I got my autism diagnosis and I'd learned a bit about autism, I started working as a consultant for Mind in Brighton and Hove. And I was basically advocating for people like myself who were autistic substance users because no one was talking about it. And that was a really cool experience. And I was, involved in a lot of stuff with that, like setting up harm reduction schemes and stuff like that, so that people who did use drugs could do so in a lower risk way. And in 2018, I started my blog, Emergent Divergence. And the rest is kind of history, because the more I wrote, the more people wanted to hear. And then people asked me to speak at things. And now, like, autism and substance use and mental health, it's like my entire profession. And I'm constantly working with people and advocating for people. And I've written books, and I've done podcasts, and I've done conferences around the world. And it's really weird looking back, because I still remember the guy who was so lost to his addiction that his family and friends had sat down to plan his funeral. And then 8 years later, here I am talking to you today, and it's a really surreal experience. And it almost feels like having two different lives in one lifetime, because who I am today is very different to who I was back then. You know, I'm really not proud of some of the things that I did back then, but I'm really proud of the stuff I do today. And what's really cool is I have a son. He's 18 months old. He's got two sisters. The three of them mean the world to me. You know, it's like, I couldn't have imagined that life could be this good. And don't get me wrong, there are challenges. You know, it is not easy living my life. But compared to what it was, compared to what it could have been, sometimes I feel like there is some kind of higher power looking out for me. And I don't strictly believe in higher powers, but sometimes when I look at all the things that have come to me since getting sober, it feels like, you know, it's very profound. And yes, that's kind of how I almost died but didn't.
Well, I'm glad you didn't. You've got so much to live for. Yeah.
It's wild now. Like, people on social media and stuff who tell me the difference I make to their lives. Like, I never imagined I'd be that person. Like, you know, the person I was sort of a decade ago was very, I'll be honest, I was selfish. I was self-centered. Everything was about, how could I get high? How could I get drunk? How could I, you know, just not have to deal with me? And now I quite like me, and I quite like the stuff I do, which I think is quite cool.
Quite rightly.
Yeah.
No, when I discovered emergent divergence on Twitter, I was thinking, great, this is a piece of the puzzle that has been missing. I really need somebody to talk about this. And I went off immediately and devoured all your blogs. I didn't know then that you'd only just realised that you were autistic.
Yeah, if I could just cut in quickly, the live stream seems to have failed to have gone to Facebook. So please, if anyone's watching this, go comment on the thing on Facebook that says I'm going live, and tell them that there's been a glitch and I need to find me on YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter. Thank you. But yeah, no, it's really cool, because like, I do independent research and stuff now, like proper academic research into autism and substance use, that sort of thing. And that it feels like there is a reason to have had all those experiences. Like, I don't know if anyone else has a story.
I just wanted to butt in and say, because I don't know if I've ever done it publicly, but as an elder, good grief, what am I doing? As an older autistic individual, late identified, then I wouldn't be where I am now if it wasn't for the journey that we'd done together, the education you'd sent me, the things you'd challenged me about, the routes you sent me, the podcasts we did together, and so on. Because you and others have been really instrumental in me understanding me as autistic Tigger. And I think it was I'm sure it was Tanya once on a live or something that I said, I feel, well, my 60th is next year, right? And it's like, wow, really? I can't believe that. And yet, as an autistic individual, I feel so young. I think Tanya said something like, baby autistic Tigger or something, and I quite liked that. And I've used it now and again, because that's sometimes what I feel. I look at all of you and I go, I've got to learn, I've got to grow. And the last bit you said about, because I think I feel the same about that, the journey we've all been on means we're instrumentally so much better in what we do now than we would have been before, because we've been on that journey, we've learned, we've grown. And you know, I'm lucky enough to have learned from such a lush individual as yourself. So thank you for what you've done to help me on my journey, and to to help me understand that I'm awesomely autistic.
Thank you, Tigger. Ollie, did you have something to add?
I've got, I suppose, a fair amount because I'll be 2 years sober at the end of April.
Congratulations.
But my sobriety journey probably started all the way back in 2012 when I was 23. And I wasn't diagnosed as autistic until I was 28. And it just hadn't occurred to me. I was very, very unwell mentally, very used to the psych wards, multiple trips, a lot of overdoses because alcohol it's a depressant, so it was actively making my mental health worse, and bearing in mind that I'd been in active addiction probably since the age of 15 due to things that have been going on in my home life that were not so pleasant. And you described being drunk at school, and I had the very same experiences in terms of substance use. I was smoking, I was drinking, I was smoking weed at school. The smoking and the weed smoking were less of an addiction, but the alcohol was definitely a very, very big thing. And yeah, in 2012 I'd taken another overdose and swallowed it down with, I think, an entire bottle of amaretto. And the nurses said to me, "Do you think you might have a problem?" And I said, "What do you mean?" They asked me, they gave me a form teaching you how to add up the alcohol units and asked me to fill it out, which I did. And I got referred to alcohol services, and that was in 2012. I have had several attempts at getting sober since then. And, this is the first time it's stuck properly. I'm like 2 years sober. With my autism, I was an autism professional for almost 10 years before getting diagnosed myself. It was 9 weeks on a psych ward before they thought to refer me for an autism assessment.
Yeah.
And during that stay on the psych ward, I had discovered how to smuggle alcohol into the psych ward. I am very, very lucky that the partner that I live with, she's got a lot of trauma surrounding alcohol and alcohol abuse. Not herself, things in her past. And for me, that is a massive motivation because I know the second I touch the drink, that's all the trust gone. I've lost her. And yeah, this year I am hopefully going to be starting training as a smart facilitator.
Okay.
Which is a peer support form of addiction recovery.
I have to say, I don't know a lot about the smart modality myself. When I was first getting sober, I was sent to 12-step programs. It didn't really sit well with me, and I ended up kind of doing my own thing. And then it was later, once I'd been sober for a while, that I heard about things like smart recovery. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to explain a bit for people who might not know, perhaps what is smart recovery?
Okay, so SMART stands for Self-Management and Recovery Training.
Okay.
The core belief of SMART is that, we don't need a higher power in order to get sober. We have to choose sobriety for ourselves, and we do have the power within ourselves to achieve that. We got ourselves addicted. We can get ourselves unaddicted. It is possible. It uses elements of CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and also REBT, and I forget what that stands for, but it's another one of the behavioural therapies. And, you know, it combines peer support with learning various different coping tools.
Yeah.
And the biggest basis of it is that, you know, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Yeah.
And, you know, for me, it's SMART is the one thing that I do every week without fail, unless I am, you know, in the hospital and ill.
Yeah.
I will find a way to join, and you know, SMART, it's not just people will go there obviously to talk about alcohol and various other substance addiction, but you find people also go to talk about things like shopping addictions, gaming addictions, gambling addictions, you know, food eating addictions. You know, if it's an addictive behavior, you can come to SMART with it. And honestly, like you, I tried AA and 12-step programs, and I just went home more depressed and started drinking again. So, and you know, the demand that we are powerless and therefore must have a higher power control us does not sit well with me either. So
No, I mean, for me, I get that, you know, 12-step has helped a fair few people, and for them, you know, great. I'm glad you found something that works. But for me, being told I was powerless was completely antithetical to what I was trying to achieve. Because it's like you said, okay, I don't see addiction as a choice. Like, I didn't wake up one day and go, today I'm going to become an addict. But I still got myself to that point. I chose to start using drugs and alcohol. I realized that they made me feel better, so I chose to carry on using them. And okay, I didn't realize what I was doing to myself at the time, but it was a series of choices that were heavily influenced by my circumstances and my mental health. But if I had the power to make those choices that led me there, then surely I have the power to make the choices that direct me away. What I needed was to understand me and why I did the things I did. And for me, that understanding came from discovering neurodiversity and neurodivergent communities. And the things I learned in those communities, actually, you know, on the surface, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, that'll help you with your addiction. But learning about burnout, learning about sensory needs, learning about communication styles, all of these things made recovery possible for me, because I suddenly knew why I had felt so broken all my life. And I then realized I wasn't broken. And it was so empowering that I was able to stay in recovery. Because I very much believe if I hadn't have discovered my own neurodivergence, I'm not sure recovery would have worked for me. But I was empowered as a person. I wasn't powerless. I was a person who did not know themselves well enough to do the things they needed to do to stay in recovery. So when I was given that information, I was now able to stay in recovery. And that was what worked for me. I was wondering, Charlie or Tigger, do either of you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. So I've never considered myself an addict, more somebody that is very much at risk, because I have these patterns of behavior where it's all or nothing and no moderation. And then a lot of it is coping mechanisms which become unhealthy. So it's things that are fun until they're not. So when I was in sixth form, I didn't drink alcohol at all, or I didn't smoke or anything. I was a right goody two shoes. And that's because my dad had been an alcoholic, and he was in recovery. He'd hit a rock bottom and nearly died, but he also smoked 40 woodbines a day, and he was just so unhealthy. I thought it was gross, so I wasn't going to do that. But then when I got to university, and that's when my undiagnosed autism and ADHD started to become a major problem for me. So I was away from all of my support network, my best friend, my mum, my brother, and really left unsupervised and ill-equipped to cope with that. And I could not do coursework. I couldn't do things like join the library and use the computer room. And I just floundered. You know, I went to some lectures and things, but I didn't do any of the coursework at all. And I buried my head in the sand about it by, you know, every time there was a deadline coming up, I'd get stoned. I'd get stoned and go to bed really early thinking I'll get up super early and write this assignment. And then I'd wake up, get stoned again. I was constantly going out drinking, going home with some stranger I'd met in a bar and then staggering up the stairs, creeping in like early in the morning, and then going back to bed for the full day and missing all my lectures. That's what I was like as a student. I was completely off the rails and also very, very vulnerable to abuse. I hung around with a lot of bikers then, and a lot of us took speed as well. And sometimes it would be cut with cocaine. And I went to wild parties where people were getting sexually abused when they were comatose from whatever concoctions and cocktails of drugs and alcohol they were on. And I didn't really think much of it at the time. So I've written Me Too stories like recently about all that. But yeah, I was just blundering through in an alcoholic stoned haze until I eventually got kicked out. So that's my sort of start to that. And then coming out of that, I've had what you would call a complicated relationship with alcohol, I think. Not really so much the drugs since I left that town where I was at university, but alcohol, I never just have a drink with a meal and then that's it. It would be like I'm going to get properly pissed or at least fully merry or completely chilled. And then if I'm in a bad place, I'm going to wake up even more depressed because, yes, it is a depressant. I've gone through phases where I've not been very much in touch with my feelings, like after my son died. And I've thought, what kind of cold-hearted bitch am I? I'm not crying. And then watched a weepy film whilst drinking a whole bottle of wine so that I could feel something. And then waking up the next day full of shame and feeling 10 times worse. So the end of the year that my son died, around the September, so about 6 months after he died, I decided I wasn't going to drink again ever. And this lasted about 6 months. It lasted until the second week of the pandemic, when all of my husband's gigs had got cancelled and we'd got like nothing to look forward to. And I thought, do you know what? I really want to cook a nice meal and have a glass or two of wine with it. But I know no moderation. So it's straight from there to back to drinking habitually, binge drinking. No, it's, yeah. I can't do moderation, basically. So that's me. But yeah, throughout that period as well, I've had various years where I've really struggled, and then I've ended up taking painkillers and then getting addicted to certain painkillers. So it's dihydrocodeine for a while. And yeah. Oh, I'm really rambling on, but yeah, let's talk about this actually. I'm going to write about this, but it's
I think
not
you
really
should.
up until now so much.
Well, thank you for sharing that. For anyone who's interested in the smart recovery that Ollie was talking about, he's shared this link, smartrecovery.org.uk. So feel free to check that out if you think that's something that could interest you. Tigger, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I put something in our little natter before we arrived, and it's interesting because I was teetotal for a number of years. Alcohol didn't interest me. My family weren't alcohol drinkers. It wasn't a kind of environment I lived in. Very early on, I was very passionately involved with the church. So the kind of drug scene and everything else wasn't something I wanted. And to be honest, a very close person in my life had been for that. Was older than myself. They'd been for like the 70s drug scene and so on. And that had a massive impact on my life with regards to, I'm not going there. I am not going there at all. But I do have a complicated relationship with alcohol. So I was teetotal. Then I go in at the moment. I'm going through a teetotal phase, but during the pandemic I wasn't. That's when I started drinking again because I was anxious and I'd lost all my routines and my structures and so on. I wasn't aware of that then, but I am now. And very much for a large period of my life when I had no idea that I was spicy. The only way I could cope with the cycles I've gone through. One of the first ones was alcohol, and I would cyclically just go out and just drink and drink and drink. I loved mixing, which would make me feel horrendously unwell, and that had a massive impact upon my life, my relationships, my work. And it just carried on. And then the other thing that hit for me as my major addiction, really, there were two. One of them was exercise, which was great when I was a youngster. I'm paying for it now. So I've done your big marathons and you're climbing up mountains and all the rest of it. And I lived to do that. When I lived, it was my obsession, it was my need. And without that, I was really in trouble. But for me, I think, when you spoke about this before, the one that came for me was food. I mean, the pandemic and a few injuries that have come up back to late as I am knocking on a bit. I used to run a lot, and my legs aren't that good at the moment, and so I have a real complex relationship with weight and food. But I realised that we must be looking at 15 years ago. I was not far off 20 stone, and for a guy that had done marathons and used to run 300-400 miles a month, whatever, cycling to and from work, all the rest of it, I'd gone from that to actually addictively, forcibly. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other week, and I went, "This is what I used to buy. These are the sandwiches I used to make, and so on, and they are all horrendously grotesque. I mean, it was all, and none of it was tasty. It was all shoved in my mouth to eat as much as I could to fill that particular need at that time. I would plan meals around what I could buy and it was auto-destructive. What I could buy, so I became incredibly obsessed with food, and to get as much food down into my stomach as possible. And then with that, we mixed alcohol as well. And that was a very complex, very dangerous phase of my life. And if I'm honest, I'm like that ever since. Yeah. And sometimes I'm great, sometimes I'm not. And I still have to admit that I'm learning more about what it means to be me as an autistic Tigger. And I understand now why so many of the things I've done, I did. Sometimes I have to be very strong. If something hits, the first thing I might do is suddenly just grab a piece of bread and shove it in my mouth as quickly as I can. And that takes me back to that feeling all those years ago. And those are the things I'm still working through, so to speak.
It's interesting that you mentioned food, because for me, there's three things I really still have a problem with. Food came out of my recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. When I was in the psych ward, eating and smoking was about all there was to do. They're not like super interesting places. So I spent a lot of time eating and smoking. So food, that's been a challenge for me as well. Because I will mention my weight. I'm a very tall guy anyway. I'm 6.5 foot tall, very broadly built. But I weigh nearly 27 stone now because I'm on schizophrenia medication, which causes weight gain at the best of times. And I have a really unhealthy relationship with food, which, I need to work on. And I'm glad that I have the emotional sobriety to realize I need to work on it, but I'm still very much in that contemplation stage. I need to move forward into that stage of action. But the other thing is I'm unmedicated ADHD, and so I self-medicate with caffeine and nicotine. So I have a vape, which is on my desk or in my hand at all times. I have at the moment, this is Sneak energy drink, which I mix up myself. It's a powder because it's sugar free, and I needed to stop drinking lots of sugary energy drinks because it was not doing my kidneys much good. So yeah, it's interesting the things, because I think when people think of addiction, they think about drugs, alcohol. But there are so many, as Ollie mentioned with the smart recovery, there are so many things you can go, I need help with this. I think we were talking briefly about, things like sex addiction in our chat before this, and certainly I can see times in my life where I wouldn't say necessarily I would have identified as a sex addict, but where I used sex as like a way of self-medicating, like making things feel better. And I can see how people could end up addicted to that. Does anyone want to add some more here?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk on that. I think I was the one that raised sex addiction
Yeah.
in the chat. And I think with this specifically, I'd like to talk about the fact of autistic sensory seeking, because some of us are sensory seeking rather than sensory avoidant. I discovered sex far younger than I probably should have done, and did not at the time understand the social context of sex and sexual activity as a thing, yay, undiagnosed autism. And it got to the point where, not only was I seeking out sex daily, I was, doing things like doing it on school property, um, you know, and when you then combine that with the alcohol addiction as a teenager, when, that awful question, what's your body count? How many people have you slept with? I've got no idea.
I have a spreadsheet.
as an adult, I only started really dealing with that at the age of 26 or 26, 27, and started being more responsible and safer. And I do not consider myself a sex addict anymore, but my sex drive is just as high as it ever was. But that took a lot of becoming self-aware of the addiction, especially as it's such it's a taboo subject, and B, it's still within the psychiatric and psychological communities considered a debate whether it's actually an addiction or not. And the other thing that I am still very much in the midst of addiction is self-harming. It is an addictive behavior. It does spiral. It does get worse. And that's something that I talk about weekly at Smart Recovery meetings. I have been free from self-harm for about 2 months now, but I am nowhere near what you would call a maintenance period of being free from that sort of behavior. So yeah, like my autism directly affected both of those sensory seeking coping mechanisms. I wouldn't have one without the other.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up self-harm, because that's something that I struggled with as well. For me, I was lucky that it was very much tied to where I was in life, and it was something that started to come to an end for me when I got control of my schizophrenia, because it was very weird. There was a sensory element to it, but then it also was all tied up in my delusions and things like that. So it was a really complicated thing to unpick. And I think actually people are often less willing to talk about self-harm than they are about addiction, even though to my mind, any addiction is a form of self-harm, because in my world, addiction is any behavior that you do to the point of harm and carry on even though it's causing harm. But for me, the very literal sense of what people would understand as self-harm, that was something I dealt with from teenage years well into adulthood. And for me, it took a lot of introspection to work out the reasons why I did that, and how to cope with that. And I think there's definitely a whole other podcast episode in here somewhere, because I do like to cover some of the difficult topics. But I'm very aware we're getting towards the end of an hour, so I don't want it to drag on too long. But I think one of the things that can really help people is to understand that addiction doesn't just have to be physical dependency. It is a need to repeat a behavior, even when doing that will have negative outcomes. or even if you don't know it's having negative outcomes, doing it despite those negative outcomes that you're unaware of. And I think when we start to view addiction like that, I don't know what other people's thoughts are, we can start to understand that there's so much more to it than that traditional view of the addict sweating and shaking and needing to go out and score, because it could apply to so many things. And I find it very strange, actually, that gaming addiction has been recognized as a formal addiction, but as you said, sex addiction is still being debated. And in my mind, why is it not the other way around? Because don't get me wrong, I believe gaming addiction exists, but I find it bizarre that people are more willing to believe gaming addiction is a thing than sex addiction. But yeah, I think we really need to, not just as a neurodivergent community, the people in the world in general need to open up a conversation about the fact that addiction isn't just what we've been told it is. I think there's a narrative around addiction that has been weaponized to drive people away from certain behaviors. Because one of the things that people don't necessarily understand about me is, like, I'm sober. I don't drink alcohol. I don't take illicit drugs. The only drugs I take are the ones prescribed by my psychiatrist. But I fully support the legalization of cannabis. It's a medicine. I fully support the legalization of psychedelic assisted therapies and its use as a medicine. I've always supported ketamine infusions for depression, and I'm glad to see it, picking up traction. I think people find it strange that I support those things, and that, I enjoy an alcohol-free beer or an alcohol-free wine when I can find a decent one. But people tend to be surprised that I do those things as a recovering addict. And one of the things I always try to explain to people is that because you're surprised by that, because the narrative around addiction has been used to manipulate you into viewing addiction in a particular way. You've been told that it has to be teetotal, abstinence, dislike of everything when you're in recovery. And it's not that simple. Like, recovery looks different for everyone. And not all drug use, not all behaviors like that are necessarily an addiction, I don't know if anyone wants to add anything here.
I think that it's not, the definition of addiction isn't very clear. So like, sometimes I've wondered about whether certain things for me are an addiction, and then I'm like, but no, it's a coping mechanism. No, it's a compulsion. No, it's validation seeking. But if you drew a Venn diagram of all those words, there would be a lot of overlap, surely.
Yeah.
But people don't know what it means, really, I think. They think, a lot of people think it's to do with things that are physically addictive, and your body makes you have it because there's some physical addiction. But no, when I was constantly going around seducing anyone of any gender that I could, that was absolutely nothing to do with my body and everything to do with validation seeking. But it was a compulsion. How do you tell the difference between a compulsion and an addiction? I don't know. But it definitely put me in some bad situations and fit that definition I said about before, that something's fun until it's not.
Yeah. Ollie or Tigger, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah. I mean, a very simple way of looking at addiction, and this is, when I speak to friends that asking me, would you consider me to have an alcohol addiction? And my answer to that is, when you're thinking about having a drink, are you thinking, oh, I'd love a drink, I want a drink, or is it, I really need a drink? It's that word need that is often the key. And you can need a drink without having physical symptoms of addiction. I mean, I did get to the point of having physical symptoms, but, when you start using alcohol or any other substance as a form of self-medication, it's that I need to do this. I am currently addicted to my phone. I need my phone on me at all times, and I need to check it every 30 seconds because, it's a compulsive behavior that I need to do. Yeah, the motivations behind a lot of the things that are not healthy for me that I need are, can vary. So, for example, with the self-harming, there's usually a trigger event that happens beforehand, and then I get the feeling of I need to do this self-harming behavior in this moment to cope. And that, at Smart Group, people talk about, when they are, again, that they have those triggering events, and it's, I need to treat myself to something. Online shopping is a very, very common addiction because it gives you the serotonins, and people end up broke because of it. But it's that thought of I need that is kind of the key to a lot of this.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well to look at how much of our autistic cells overlap all these areas as well, because that's the journey I've been on, certainly going back, going, no, I think I understand. Now I think I understand. But also, like you've all said, if you mention to somebody addiction, they think of something there. There's a massive line which I think that people aren't talking about, because Bobby's put in there about this is such an important topic, and it is. So there's such a huge area that either we don't want to talk about or we don't know about, so to speak, as the general kind of public. And it's saying about the fact that there's so much we need to think about when it comes to addiction and those drives, far more than just the usual idea of drugs and alcohol and so on and so forth. I think it's a really important discussion to have.
And I just wanted to say something that this has amused me the whole way through since I saw this comment. So this comment came in from Michael on YouTube, and Michael and I went to the same uni at the same time. I don't think we were particularly in each other's social circles, but it says something about what my behavior was like that he knew about me back then. And it's weird to look back and think that people heard about the guy who, people literally used to walk up to me and be like, "How are you not dead yet?" And I used to think that was a compliment. It wasn't. They were genuinely concerned. But it's funny because Michael found my social media a while ago and was just like, "I don't know if you remember me. We went to the same uni, and by the way, you have changed so much." And I was like, I never really thought about what I was like back then too much, because it's something I've tried to put out of my mind, but so much of it overlaps, as Tigger said, with, like, when I look back, so much of it makes sense now that I know I'm autistic. I look back over my life and I'm like, that was an autistic person who had so many unmet needs and tried to meet them himself and really did not do a very healthy job of it. And that's been really important for me. As Tigger said, going back and look, almost like reframing your life with that new knowledge.
That's why I've read your book twice on this. Yeah, because I read your book and what you said about the moral model of addiction, and I just felt a lot better about myself and a lot less like a bad person, and actually someone that had been let down quite a lot and left to sink on their own.
Yeah, and I think, I wish we had time to really get into the moral model of addiction, because, that really irks me, the fact that so much morality is placed on addiction, and it's not about morality.
And recovery programs.
Yes, and there are certain recovery programs that push the morality model, in my opinion. Which I don't think is very healthy. Just a note, because you've mentioned my books, you can find them at the link here.
Unusual Medicine. Yeah, I've read it twice.
emergentdivergence.com/my-books. Obviously you're talking about Unusual Medicine, which I actually wanted that to be the first book I ever published, but I ended up publishing a different book first. But that was, something that I really wanted to do once I was firmly in recovery, was, talk about this, because that's why I started blogging. That's why I started advocating in the community. I walked into this community and went, no one is talking about this. Like, why is no one talking about this? Because I was meeting more and more people who on the down low were like, yeah, this is me too. And I was like, but none of us are talking about it. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do the talking then.
I do make a point of talking about it on my own social media, because it's still seen as very taboo, to the point where my own family decided to say to me, you need to stop posting about that. Some things should be kept private. And I'm thinking, no, screw you.
Yeah.
Something I've learned is when people tell me I shouldn't be talking about something, it's probably something that really needs talking about.
It's a taboo that needs smashing when people say that. Yeah. Let's crack this wide open and have a look at what's lurking around in there.
I think my particular brand of neurodivergence as well doesn't really appreciate being told what I should and shouldn't talk about. Like, it almost feels like a microaggression, like you're autistic and don't understand the rules. Like, I don't care about the rules. I'm going to talk about this.
Me too. Well, I didn't talk a lot about this when I had a permanent job in HR, but it's 9 months now I've been self-employed and all kinds of stories of mine.
And I do recognize there has to be a level of privilege to be able to talk about these things openly, because you're right. If you'd have talked about this whilst under a contract in an HR job, that could have been something that came back on you.
Yeah.
And for me, like, I'm largely self-employed, so I answer to myself. And if I say something, the people who work with me don't like it, that's on me. It doesn't reflect on anyone else. I mean, I do work for a charity. I work for Gecko Community. They are very supportive, and the work they do is fantastic. And I'm glad that as an employer, they're very supportive of my online work. The sort of this sort of stuff. But this is the other thing as well. I don't hide my addiction from anyone anymore. Like, I am a recovering addict, and if you're going to work with me, then you need to be aware of that. This informs who I am as a professional today. Like, in fact, it's largely the reason I am the professional I am today. But it does. There's certainly a conversation to be had there about the privilege that requires to be able to say that. Anyway, we're sort of getting to the end of our time. Are there any sort of last things anyone wanted to add?
Thank you so much for doing this work, David. I really appreciate it, and I know a lot of other people who do as well.
Yeah, just thanks for inviting me on. And I just want to say, like, it was your discussion of addiction which pointed me to your page in the first place. So yeah, thanks for inviting me on.
Yes, and we've definitely got to have you back on again, Ollie, because I think there's a lot more conversation we can have. So, we'll perhaps have a chat about doing some more episodes.
And you got. I'm surprised. I'm going to mention coffee once. Go on, please.
Yeah,
because before we went on, you said you got a coffee drawer and stuff. Again, echo everybody else has said. This is such an important area, and again, every day I kind of read a bit, see something that you will share, and go, "Wow, that's a really cool." Then my brain goes off, and so it's just congratulations and thank you for letting my old Tigger and baby Tigger come in here at the same time, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, thank you, all three of you, for coming on. And I want to say celebrating my 8 years of sobriety, but I really like the fact that I've taken that celebration with all of you and we've turned it into together an educational experience for people. So that's my vibe. So
I hope I get to 8 years.
I have faith that you will get there. And I think this is the thing, like, for a lot of people, because people are like, how did you do it? What did you need to use? So many people don't realize, especially when they're in the midst of addiction, you get to that point where you feel like things are never going to be okay and you're never going to crack recovery. You're never going to get to a point where you feel confident in recovery. And something that I would like people to understand is that all of us in recovery, especially in longer term recovery, I know it's a very strange experience for me here today at 8 years. I too had a time where I thought I needed to give up and it was never going to happen. But it did happen. And it's not a straightforward path. Sometimes you get a bit of recovery under your belt and then you go backwards. That's just part of the recovery journey. Like, it's not supposed to be a straight line from A to B. It's a winding path through experiences and hindsight and learning and growth. And that learning and growth is not a comfortable experience. So, you know what? Like, no, recovery is not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it is possible. And I know not everyone gets to experience that. But there's always the chance that you will be one of those people who does. And I think all the time that chance exists, it's worth it to keep working at it. Anyway, thank you to all three of you for coming on this evening. I'm going to play my outro video now. And thank you to everyone who's listened. There will be another episode coming up soon. Once I confirm it, I will share it out. But thank you, everyone, and take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.